Hello and welcome to episode 63 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we have a new set of Call of Duty League matches to talk about. The first weekend without Scump in the Call of Duty League. And speaking of Scump, he also had a pretty successful weekend co-streaming the CDL that we'll discuss later in the show. And we also have some roster news that we should cover as well during this podcast episode. But before we do any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm all right. Ready to jump right in.
All right, let's just start with the first match of the week because it leads into our only real roster change that we're probably going to talk about as well. New York versus Florida. Not a surprising result, at least in our eyes. We both went with New York to win this one, and they did 3-1. Any thoughts on this match in general, and then we can hop into this roster news.
I think the biggest thing to point out is, and we'll talk about the record in a little bit, but it was a 3-1 win for New York in which Florida wins the S&D but loses all three respawns. As we're going to get into in a little bit in a second here, I mean, I guess I might as well, I can bring it up. According to BreakingPoint.gg, Florida's records so far this year, they're 4-18 in hardpoint, 11-5 in search, and 6-6 in control. The control 6-6 is whatever 500 record. But the 4-18 in hardpoint really stands out. And conversely, 11-5 in search, it's not the best, but it's a 2-for-1 ratio, so it's pretty good. So that's pretty glaring, and obviously when you're losing that many hard points and you're struggling, and they played decently at Major 1, were able to knock out OpTic in the group play, but if you're struggling that much in hard point, which we say S&D is the most important mode, but you play 2 hard points in a 4-game series too, just like you play 2 S&Ds in a 5-game series. So if you want to get to a game 5, which obviously Florida does with how well they play in search, they're going to have to play 2 hard points, and it's kind of tough to get to that game 5 if you're consistently losing 2 hard points, because then that means the other team just has to steal the control or steal the S&D from under you too. So it's hard to succeed as a CDL team when you are struggling that mightily in hardpoint, and it seems like that could have been the reason for the change that Florida announced today, which is Dave Patty coming in for Brack.
Yep. So if you want to read an article about it, we have a story on .esports.com from our good friend Scott. He wrote up today that, like you said, Brack has been benched, and Dave Patty, who was on the starting roster for Florida most of the season last year and was the only holdover, or not the only holdover, but he was brought back this season despite not immediately starting for the Mutineers. He will be replacing Brack in the starting lineup, which I think, I didn't really have very high expectations for Florida, and I don't think you did either, just based on the roster they had announced. And they haven't been terrible, but they also, like you've illustrated with your the map counts and stuff, they haven't been good either, specifically in hardpoint, which, like you said, is very, very important. Like, it's very hard to win series if you're not winning hardpoints. And this is a surprising change in the sense that they made it right now and they didn't wait after a major, which is typically when teams decide to make these changes. So why do you think that they opted to do this right now, heading into the third and final week of online qualifiers?
The only logical explanation I can think of is that they just think Dave Patty will help improve their hard point. Looking at the numbers from that perspective, that's really the only thing I can think of. It's actually pretty impressive that, surprising to me that Brack was the move here. Obviously, Dave Patty's a slower AR player, so you're not gonna you assume they wouldn't have Dave Patty return for Havoc or Vickle, because then you're just having a really heavy AR team, and not a lot of subs, similar to what happened last year when they had Awakening Skies and Dave Patty. Um, but if we look at the stats again, presented by Breaking Point, Brack actually had the highest KD in all three game modes for Florida this year so far. He had a 1.04 in hardpoint to lead the team. The next highest was Major Maniac with a 0.95. In Search, he had a 1.3 overall KD. The next highest was a 1.19 from Havoc, which those are just both absurd. And actually, they have all over a 1.05 in S&D, the four for Florida, which again just speaks to how well they've played in Search this year. And then in Control, Brack has a 1.0, the only 1.0 KD on the team. The next highest is Havoc with a 0.97. So had the highest KD in all three modes and gets benched. It's got to be something with chemistry, or they think Dave Patty's just going to help try to improve their hard point. I don't really know, but when you look at the stats in that sense, it goes back to something we've talked about multiple times on this podcast, that contrary to what many fans in the competitive Call of Duty community think, KD isn't everything.
Yeah, it's definitely not. We've seen it in the past where players that, are pretty much being complained about or roasted online for however bad their KD is or whatever stat that they want to bring up. And they consistently stay on teams. They're a part of winning teams. It's happened before. It'll always happen because there's only so many kills on the map. But we also just don't even know the team dynamics of so many of like these changes. It could have been like regardless of the talent that Brack brought or however many good things he brought, maybe they weren't clicking as a team, which is always something to keep an eye out for. I was looking at the Florida stats from last season just to see, because I know that Dave Patty was in the roster for most of the season last year. And this is for the whole season, so obviously kind of cut out a little bit of it, but they were 31-31 in hardpoint, and then they had a losing record in Search, and then a even record again in Control. So at least last season, where Dave Patty played 3/4 of the year with them, they were 500 in hardpoint and Control. And they weren't bad in Search and Destroy. They were like 40-45% win percentage, which isn't great, but it's a lot better than being what did you say, 4-18 in hardpoint this season. Yeah, it's a lot better than that. So it could just come down to, again, like we've had an AR heavy meta, which is kind of unusual for modern Call of Duty. It typically leans towards, the ARs are usually good, but a lot of times in recent years, we've seen like the MP5, for example, just be like the god gun that everybody wants to use. Whereas now we have a pretty AR dominant meta that maybe will suit Dave Patty, but it's kind of remained to be seen on that. Any other thoughts on this change now that Florida's announced that they actually are making a change, and they're one of the few teams so far to actually have announced any changes?
I was excited to see Brack actually get a shot in the CDL this year. Talked about it heading into the season, how he was on that Toronto 10-man squad for the first inaugural season of the CDL. He didn't get his shot to actually play on the main squad. He was on the academy squad all year. So I was looking forward to seeing him play this year. And obviously, looking at the stats, he played well statistically speaking. So I just got to say, I hope Brack is able to find some success, and assuming he goes down and plays in challengers, hopefully he's able to continue frying down there and maybe gets another shot here soon. Hopefully, if it'd be a different conversation if he wasn't the top KD for his team in all three game modes. But when you're producing numbers like that, even if we're saying stats aren't everything, they do gotta mean something in some cases. So looking forward to seeing what he can do going forward, if he's able to find a challengers team, or if he goes down there and continues to play well, maybe he'll get another shot this year.
Yep, definitely something to keep an eye on. And Dave Patty's been kind of grinding away in challengers so far this season. Just kind of put a cap on this. So in the North America Cup, they did go to Raleigh, and they finished top 6. So he's been playing with Gravity, Capstone, and Hixie. So all guys that have been in the CDL or on CDL rosters before. And that's who he's been playing with. It looks like the entire season so far in Modern Warfare, which is good, obviously, to have like a consistent roster, which is pretty much the like the opposite for challengers teams most of the time. They're almost always making changes. So, very interesting
Still
to
early.
see. Yeah, it is. But it'll be interesting to see how Brack responds, if he's able to kind of even fight again back into the CDL. And like it is early, like you said, in the CDL, we could very well see Brack back in this Florida lineup at some point, depending on how the results go, and maybe replacing someone else in the roster. It's very hard to tell at this moment.
I mean, even just thinking about that roster you just mentioned for Dave Patty, if Brack is able to, do a 1-for-1 swap there and go down and play with Gravity, Capsule, and Hixie, those are all guys who, have good experience in challengers and have a little experience in the CDL2. Obviously, Capsule just most recently subbed in for LAT, so we don't know the situation there. But whenever Kenny is feeling well again and able to return to action, you assume Capsule is going to go back down to challengers. There would just probably be a problem. Actually, yeah, they couldn't do that roster because I think you're only allowed to have 2 CDL subs on an amateur team, and Hixie's a Toronto sub, Capsule would be a Thieves sub, and Brack would be a Florida sub. So yeah, I don't know, but if they can do that, depending on Capitol's contract situation, maybe you only sign like a 2-week deal or something. Who knows? But yeah, we can wrap up by saying that if Brack were to just replace Dave Patty on that lineup, that wouldn't be the worst challengers lineup I've ever heard.
Coincidentally, I just saw a tweet that says Diamond Con will be filling in for Dave Patty in that lineup for the elite the elite playoffs. So it was just tweeted by the rotation like 5 minutes ago. So so congrats to Diamond Con.
That would mean Brack could go to. Actually, no, it doesn't.
Yeah, because Diamond Con's out of LG Academy.
The Academy, and obviously LG Academy has Spartan Neptune, so if the 2-man rule is in effect, he couldn't go there either. So Brack might have a problem finding a team, but wishing him the best.
Yep. It's not fun to be in challengers. I'm pretty sure for anybody, but Brack, especially now that I think it's pretty close to the major, and it's kind of a bad time to get benched from a team. There's not a lot of teams out there looking for one. So yeah, Brack has been benched from Florida, and let's move on to some of these other matches. Which this next one is, it was probably the most anticipated match of the entire weekend. OpTic's first match without Scump, playing the Seattle Surge. And Scump was doing a watch party at the OpTic headquarters during the match, had, I don't even know, 70,000 viewers. He had, I believe, more viewers than the main CDL stream at one point. So OpTic playing with Dashy in replacing Scump. So a real weird roster, a lot of questions about the chemistry issues, considering Dashy has been benched. Illy and Dashy were, temporarily dropped in the offseason. A lot of drama between Rambo, the head coach of OpTic, and Dashy. But the team looked pretty good, and they pulled a reverse OpTic. They lost both hard points, and they won both searches. I guess let's just get your thoughts in general about this match, because we've talked a lot about Seattle and the Pred situation, which is a big coincidence that he plays OpTic in Scump's first match or OpTic's first match after Scump's retirement. Pred plays OpTic, and Seattle has also not had a great season since they had that first major victory, first major runner-up performance. So what do you think of OpTic versus Seattle?
Yeah, this doing it piecemeal here, because OpTic played 2 matches this weekend. But just talking about this one match in particular, obviously, like you said, it's a little surprising to be talking about an OpTic team that doesn't win hardpoint and wins both searches. Which, if that was the case going into their following match, I would have been a little concerned or having a different conversation here. But just for this match in particular, it makes sense that Seattle was able to beat them in hardpoint. I think I saw a tweet before the matches last week that like Dashy's plane to Texas got delayed or something, or his flight got canceled, and they weren't able to scrim like the day before. So like they had limited practice already because Scump retired on what was the Monday, right? So like they had like 4 days of practice max, and one of them might have gotten chalked due to flights. So limited practice for OpTic with this four-man squad of Shotzi, Illy, Hook, and Dashy. It makes a little bit of sense going up against a strong slaying team like Seattle, that Seattle wins those hard points. But based on OpTic's performance earlier in the year, it is interesting they're able to clutch up and take the S&Ds. At the same time, is this Seattle's only match of this weekend? I think it was. So at the end of this match, Breaking Point tweeted out that Seattle are 0-10 in S&D and online qualifier matches this year. So, I mean, they have a really good S&D coach in Equip, but they got to go back to the drawing board if they're struggling that mightily in Search and Destroy, particularly in the online qualifier matches. That could be a situation we've talked about in the past with just online struggles because they did just come in second at the major, and obviously I don't have their S&D record at that major in front of me, but I would assume it was better than 0-10. So. Maybe Seattle's just a better team on land than online, but yeah, I just think that it's a team that has potential. We've talked about it before, and it's a team that last year, even with this exact same lineup, had flip-flop moments where they were going on win streaks and then they were going on losing streaks, hot and cold, however you want to phrase it, but this isn't the first time we've seen Seattle go on a bit of a losing streak. It does come at a time where it follows that, the roster drama and the potential Pred acquisition by OpTic, and we've talked about that in the last couple shows, how that affects Seattle's team chemistry and that sort of thing. But we're just going to have to see if Seattle is able to bounce back in this final week of qualifiers heading into the major, because I just had it and I lost it. Pretty sure Seattle is in last place because they're 0-3, but let me make sure. Yeah, they're 0-3 in the major two qualifiers, the only team without a win right now. So they gotta basically go 2-0 this following week to have a shot at not starting in the loser bracket in Boston.
Yeah, and I just looked up the Seattle Surge's stats for the major, their map stats. So according to Breaking Point, they were 4-5 at the major in Search, and but that was their worst game mode. They were 7-4 in Hardpoint and 5-2 in Control. So yeah, definitely a big drop off from that. Even that's almost 500, which you take, like, obviously if you're good in the other two game modes and you can kind of just split Search and Destroys, you could probably win a lot of matches and even tournaments. But when you're winless, you can't even buy a win in Search. That's concerning, and it's especially concerning. Like, I respect the individual skill level and the talent of in Search and Destroy of the OpTic players. Like, that's a nasty squad to go up against in Search, but like you said, they didn't really have a lot of practice, and for them to win 12-6 in rounds, win both of the searches, that's not a good sign for Seattle. It could be more of an online thing, who knows, but we kind of have to take these results at face value and not kind of distribute blame about the online stuff anyway. But yeah, definitely something to be a little concerned about if you're a Surge fan, just because, I mean, they had a real habit of going up and down last year, and you don't want that to happen again, because who knows, like, they finished on on the incline. They finished in third last year at champs, but what if they finish this season on a down note? What if that's the time that they start dipping and they either don't make it to champs, or obviously get really bad placing at champs. That's something to look out for, but probably a little ahead of ourselves on that point. But yeah, the OpTic, let's talk about the other OpTic match real quick so we can kind of move on from the OpTic stuff as a whole. So OpTic also played the Boston Breach this week. Nope, not Boston Breach. Toronto. They played the Toronto Ultra. I don't know what I was actually looking at when I pulled that up. So OpTic played Toronto on Saturday, and they kind of pulled an opposite. They won 2 hard points and a search in this, which is pretty surprising, especially considering we both picked Toronto going into this. The Ultra had looked like one of the better teams in the league, and we were concerned about the lack of practice with OpTic and the potential chemistry issues that they could face. But it didn't seem to bother OpTic at all during this. What's your take on this match?
Yeah, just to set the stage a little bit so
Yeah.
we can move on from Toronto as well. The final match on Friday was LA Thieves versus Toronto. Capsidal played in place of Kenny, who was ill. So Capsidal made his CDL return, and Toronto made quick work of LA Thieves 3-0. Capsidal played pretty well for a last-minute sub. He had the most kills on LA Thieves in this match at 48. Octane was next highest at 46. So it was a quick series. Toronto looked strong. Obviously, you can't take much away from that because, like you just said, Toronto has been looking like a really strong team. They were playing against a team with a last-minute sub. So that's a match you expect Toronto to win. And similarly, that sets the stage for this OpTic match where they're playing another team again with not a last minute at sub, and Dashy isn't necessarily a last minute sub to the same capacity that Capsule was, but
Sure.
it's again a squad against a new lineup. OpTic did have the previous match against Seattle the very day before too to try and get acclimated to the new squad, but like you said, both of us predicted Toronto here, thinking they should take care of business against a new look OpTic squad, and OpTic was able to win this one by winning 2 hard points in the S&D, and that's kind of what I was talking about with that Seattle match where, they didn't win the hard points in that match, but you don't really expect them to win the hard points against a team as strong as Toronto, and they're able to do that. That's a really good sign for OpTic moving forward. So they have a 2-0 week against Seattle, who was second in Major 1, and Toronto got 4th, I think. I knew Seattle got second. I think Toronto got 4th because it was New York, Seattle, Faves, and then I believe Toronto. So it's 2 quality wins for OpTic, especially for a new roster, and the way they got both wins was different, obviously going from winning no hard points to winning 2 in the very next series against a very strong team in Toronto. So that was a surprising result to see. But obviously, if you're a Greenwall fan, that's gotta have your hopes up for the future of this squad and the potential that they have.
I think we should also mention that Italy played out of the Toronto Ultra facility because he's been stuck in Canada back home because of visa issues, and people were saying that he was they probably kicked him out right afterward because you can't do that. You can't take advantage of your hosts like that. But yeah, I think that's really cool of Toronto to allow that to like help him out while he's away from the facility in Texas, and he's back home because of stuff outside of his control. And also just a really good week for OpTic. I mean, the beginning of the week probably sucked for every OpTic fan in the world because Scump retired, and then by the end of the week, I feel like a lot of those same OpTic fans were more hopeful because they showed signs of life. The team was, very hit and miss so far this season, but to beat Seattle, even with their, down times in search and destroy, and to beat a team like Toronto, who I think many people consider to be a top 4 team, definitely a team to look out for the rest of the season. To beat those kind of teams is very impressive, and now that they're 3-0 in stage 2, they have a really good good look at Major 2. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be hopeful for OpTic. And looking at the stats, it's like Hook kind of, his search was incredible. He had a 1.69 KD in search, and I mean everybody kind of went off in search and destroy, which they went 3-0 in S&D this week, which is a very non-OpTic thing to do at times. So I there's really nothing bad to say about OpTic. It's about whether they can continue this, especially when they get to LAN. And especially if Illy has any more visa issues, because that's something to keep an eye out for. Hopefully he doesn't, because we want to see all of them compete at the LAN together. But I think that is something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, and just real quick too, similar
Yeah.
to how Illy was competing out of Toronto, I believe Capsule was competing from the OpTic HQ. So
Sweet.
really cool to see the teams helping each other out, because you never know when you're going to be in a situation. Obviously, OpTic was in that situation with Toronto, so they're getting the help from Toronto, and then they're willing to extend a hand to Nate Shot's team. So pretty cool to see there. And I will just say too, there was an interesting moment in this OpTic Toronto match where in the map 3 control, I believe it was when Toronto was up 2-1. They won 3-1, so I'm pretty sure, yeah, they were up 2-1 in the control, but down 0-2 in the series. Scrappy just unloaded a full clip into Shotzi's body after killing him towards the end of the map. Which was pretty interesting. I'm all for the in-game banner and trash talk. I'm a little on the fence about shooting bodies, because I have seen plenty of cases where I've shot bodies and it's come back to bite me. So I thought that was interesting, and they talked about it on I saw a clip from Scump's watch party too, where they were talking about him and just Scrappy in general, and like Scump and Hex are kind of like giving him just a little bit of praise, saying that like I'm pretty sure Scump was kind of like it takes balls to come into the league talking trash, but to do that and be able to back it up is impressive. So well, we've talked about Scrappy throughout this year so far. He's in my eyes on pace to be Rookie of the Year, barring any situation where a rookie comes in mid-season and wins a tournament, similar to what we saw last year, or years prior, where it kind of skews Rookie of the Year voting. But yeah, I think this was an interesting match, a good one, obviously, for OpTic. We'll on the other side have to see how Toronto responds, but they're still a top team heading into the majors. So we'll just have to see how they bounce back.
Next match was on the first match of Saturday, Boston versus Vegas. We talked a little bit about Boston because we didn't talk about Boston. Boston and Vegas. I'm all over the place. I'm sad because I picked Vegas, just kind of hopping on the bandwagon, and I think their season's over now. They lost to the Breach 3-1. Just not a good start for Vegas, and it didn't get much better later in the week. But any thoughts on this Breach versus Legion match?
It's very similar to the first match we talked about with Florida and New York, where in this situation, Boston wins the 3 respawns. Vegas is only able to take the search. I would have to actually dig into it a little bit, because I feel like I've seen Vegas play a lot of Mercado search, and I feel like I've seen them do very well on Mercado search. So they won 6-1 against Boston, which is obviously a pretty lopsided victory on that map in particular. So that's one thing to take away from Vegas, at least. Similar to Florida, they're playing well in search, it seems like. So and they when they won't beat Seattle earlier, they won 2 searches. That was their only match before this one that we're talking about. So yeah, I mean, and Breaking Point tweeted after this match, this doesn't count their following match later in this weekend, but as of this particular match against Boston, Legion had won 11 of their last 12 search and destroy games. So if there's any silver lining for Vegas in this match in particular, at least they're playing well in search.
So they have played Mercado 3 times this season, but they played Fortress a lot and LSELO a lot.
Must just be recency, because they played, spoiler alert for the later match, they played Mercado against London, they won that 6-2. So in their last two matches, they've won 6-2 and 6-1 on Mercado search. So that just must be what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, so let's just go through their stats real quick because this is really interesting. They are 14-5 in search. Obviously, that's counting their loss to London as well. So 14-5 in search, 7-18 in hardpoint. And they're winless on Fortress and Hotel in hardpoint. And then on control, they are 3-10. They are horrible in respawns. But it's kind of a testament that they were able to get a top 6 finish at the major, despite not being great in respawn at the moment. But yeah, not too surprising that they would lose as well against Boston, considering those stats now. Next match of the week: London versus LAT. And this was a big bounce back game for LAT, considering they've really struggled so far. And Capsule again filled in for Kenny for this match as well, and a pretty clean sweep for the Thieves. They beat London, who we probably should talk about. Did we talk about the zero stuff last week?
It wouldn't have been last week, so
2
no,
weeks
I
ago?
guess not.
Or
This would have been Paul X's first game back, right?
yeah, I think we talked about the scrap stuff.
Yeah.
So we didn't talk about the zero stuff. So yeah, so zero he was replaced in the London starting lineup by Paul X, who had been recently replaced by Scraps in the lineup. And I mean, let's just get your thoughts on this, because I think that it's like it's just sucks. Like I really like zero. I think that as the only European team and as the only English team, like London should really try to stick to that English core. And I most like attach zero to London now because he's been with them for several years, even though he what was it, 2020, that he like barely played at all because of visa issues during COVID. Like
I think it was Cold War, so 2021.
Yeah, 2021. But I still kind of attach him and London together because he's been there for a while. And to see him get benched and then they come out first match with Paul X and they get swept. What do you think about the roster change to put Paul X back in the lineup?
I was surprised by it. There was especially that little back and forth between Paul X and Scraps on Twitter, which you can't take too much from, but it did exist, where it was kind of like Scraps felt like Paul X was leaking. Scraps returned to the roster or whatever.
Yeah.
So then, just the following week to have them playing together could be, interesting recipe there. But obviously, this is just the first match for this squad. We got another one for London to talk about very shortly. But it is a tough situation for a new squad going up against a team with an emergency sub in LA Thieves here. It's kind of just like a coin toss at that point between which squad with minimal practice together is able to pull it out, and just so happens LA Thieves were able to get that, and it was a big win for the Thieves too, because they're now 1-3 in the qualifier. So if they had lost that match, they would be 0-4 down there with Seattle, but with only one match to play, they would almost be guaranteed to start Major 2 in loser bracket. So being 1-3 means they only have one match this following week, which is a must win if they don't want to start down in the loser bracket. I don't know who it's against off the top of my head. I can scroll down and find it, but it's against Boston, so that's not a particularly easy match. But again, if the Thieves want to avoid the losers bracket in Major 2, this was a big win, and this following match against Boston will be too.
Yeah. As for London, I think that it's like it's not great that their season has been the way it is. Like they are right now, like in the overall standings this season, they're in last place. They're 3-7 on the season. They have the fewest CDL points, even though there's like a 5-way tie for 8th or something like that. So like that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, but also it's not good to start off so poorly. But I also don't know if Paul X coming into the lineup is really going to be like this, whatever, like turnaround that they need. Um, we'll talk about in a little bit about their second match and how they won and stuff, but I still don't think that this is like a long-term solution to anything. I just think that this roster is not very good. In it wasn't a very good roster, at least on paper, coming into the season. I think a lot of people believed that this was, one of the worst teams in the league heading into the year, and they've kind of proved that. They're nobody else has fewer than 5 or fewer than 4 wins. They have 3. It's just not been a good start to the season, but I also don't like to see 0 on the bench when, I think it's kind of a branding opportunity to be like the only English and the only European team, but like half the team now is Americans, or not Americans, North Americans, because ASIM is Canadian. So, yep, but we'll see. And for LAT, I mean, it was a good win. It was definitely much needed, even if Kenny wasn't in the roster. They just kind of need to get it going. It's definitely not a cause for concern because they did this pretty much half the season last year, where they were just kind of like win, lose, 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 and then they come back and the end of the season they were the best team. I think there was a stat though that this was their first win in stage 2 of like either this season or last season. Like they had lost all of their matches in stage 2 last year. I think that's what maybe Octane tweeted. So that's pretty crazy if that's a true stat. But yeah, definitely a good win for LAT. And last match of Saturday, because we already talked about the Toronto OpTic stuff, Atlanta versus Minnesota, which was a very surprising result. We both picked Atlanta to win this, as most people would, and Minnesota end up sweeping FaZe. And I mean, I don't even know how to react to that, because Atlanta had looked pretty good, all things considered. Not as strong as their peak in 2021, but also like Minnesota has not looked great, or had not looked great to this point, and even after this, they didn't look great. So, what do you think about this? A 3-0 win for the Rocker?
Yeah, I really was speechless when this happened. I still can't wrap my brain around it because, like you said, Atlanta was looking good coming into this because they had just swept Seattle. Obviously, Seattle's had its own struggles in these online qualifiers, but it was a pretty convincing 3-0 from Atlanta in the past week. So coming off this, where Minnesota had its struggles, they had like the food poisoning situation, but they were able to pull off a win against London, I think, to end last week. To have Minnesota 3-0 FaZe here, I was just super surprised by that. Looking at the scores too, it was Albagra Fortress Hardpoint 250 to 246. Hotel Search was 6-3, and then Fortress Control was 3-2. So 6-3 isn't the closest search, obviously, but the other 2 maps very close. But just a very surprising result overall. And like you said, kind of had a little bit of a role reversal for these 2 teams on Sunday that maybe indicates that something might have been going on for this match. But it's a very quality win for Minnesota. And as we're about to talk about, Atlanta was able to bounce back with a quality win of its own.
Yeah, definitely surprising, and they literally kind of reverted back to the mean immediately the next day. We might as well just talk about Minnesota losing to LAG 3-1, and then Atlanta beating New York 3-2. So those, we have Atlanta getting swept on Saturday, and then beating what is the best team in the league in the final match on Sunday, and Minnesota sweeping Atlanta and then immediately losing to LAG, who are not like, I mean, I can't say they're not good, but they're not like, they don't have a ton of chemistry. This is a pretty much entirely new roster that's kind of been flipped. Like Aristides has basically joined LAG Academy. So I guess, where do you want to talk about Minnesota, or do you want to talk about Atlanta?
I mean, we can just get Vegas London out of the way too. Doesn't really matter.
Yeah, so Vegas, London, like we just talked about with London losing to LAT and Vegas losing to Boston, they both played on Sunday against each other. We both picked Vegas because we're idiots, and
Whoa, whoa, whoa,
we always pick against London, and now they win. So London, they win 3-1. Scraps goes off on hard point. Vegas, I mean, I I need to stop picking them because it's happening again. Vegas is winning champs. Mike
whoa.
said in the chat. I just don't know. I don't know at this point. And after this, I think it was Clay that he tweeted that he was having really good practice, but every time he gets in the match, he's pretty much underperforming now. Which he was trying to or he was venting about how he's trying to figure it out because he doesn't understand why he's not able to perform up to his standard in the game. So I thought that was a very interesting thing to tweet. But yeah, Vegas losing to London. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing here was just Scraps absolutely went off for London. Went 95 and 54 for a 1.76 KD in the series. The next highest kills, Paul X had 79, and then the highest kills on Vegas was 79 from Temp. So almost a 20 kill difference between Scraps and the next closest player in the series. So just a tremendous performance out of him. And maybe that's just, what London needs if this team and this lineup in particular is going to work. They need prime Scraps to come back. Obviously, him just recently making his return, it would make sense if it took him a couple matches to get back into his groove. But I'm not saying Scraps is going to drop a 1.76 every series, but if Scraps is frying and dropping big numbers, then that might be what London needs to succeed, and especially in a series where Asim, who in my opinion has been the best player on London this year, Asim has the lowest KD. That kind of reflects just Asim in general, his play style. He doesn't really care about stats. At least it seems like he doesn't, and he does the dirty work and stuff like that. So, when he was performing well statistically, London might not necessarily have been having the best results, but with somebody else like Scraps picking up the slaying work, maybe that allows Asim to open up more routes and do that dirty work I was mentioning to help lead the team to a win in other ways outside of just slaying. So, again, limited sample size here, especially for just London with Scraps and London with this particular four-man roster. So we'll have to see more out of them. But kind of like we were just saying with LA Thieves, this win over Vegas puts London at 1-3. So if they hadn't won, they would be 0-4, with only one match almost guaranteed to start the major in the losers bracket. At 1-3 with one match this upcoming week, they at least put themselves in a position with tiebreakers to have a shot at getting one of the lower seeds in the winners bracket for Major 2.
Yeah, and to kind of follow up on my point about Clayster, he had a really bad series. 14 and 30 in the first hard point, then 16 and 30 in the control, and then he wasn't too bad in the search or the second hard point, but he was not at least for a KD perspective, he was not above a 1 KD in any of the four maps. Whereas you look at Temp 25 and 18 on that second hard point, 30 and 21 in the control. Definitely just not a good series as a whole for Vegas. And it kind of comes back to they are pretty horrible when it comes to respawns. Again, they literally did it again where they won the search and destroy but lost all three of those respawns, which is not a recipe for success, and it's more of a recipe for a roster change, if anything, down the line. And I'm fearful for my boy Clayster. I've talked about how much how I think he's like my favorite player, and he's obviously one of the best Call of Duty players of all time, but not a real good start, or not a good middle, I guess, of these Major 2 qualifiers for him or Vegas. And let's go to these LAG, Minnesota, and New York versus Atlanta. Let's start with the Gorillas and the Rocker. So there were technical difficulties during this. I can attest to them because I only live about 2.5 hours away from Columbus, where the the CDL production crew is. And I also am from Columbus. So I was talking to my parents and they said that they were getting a bunch of snow. Well, apparently that snow turned into a big storm that caused the CDL production crew's power to go out. So this series actually finished off stream. I think they only played one map, if I'm not mistaken, off stream. But you know, it was a weird thing, and I'm glad that it was played off stream because that's kind of, you know, you get to stay tuned essentially if you don't do that. But yeah, just a weird way to finish a series, but the Gorillas finished the series nonetheless. They looked really good in hardpoint, which is, you know, kind of surprising, especially considering Minnesota had just beaten Atlanta in a really tough hardpoint. But RC's looked really good in that first hardpoint. What do you think of the series and LAG's win here?
Yeah, obviously, like you said, didn't get to watch the second hard point, but
Yeah.
our cities went absolutely off on the first hard point. And I've really liked this iteration of LAG. I've been on the Joe Deceives hype train a little bit. I think Assault and Exceed have had their moments too. So this team has definitely shown, at least in my opinion, a little more potential than the roster LAG had at the start of the year, which obviously just didn't work out. So I'm interested to see how things continue for the Gorillas. I've picked them a couple times in these Major 2 qualifiers now, and I think so. Yeah, they had a winnable. I feel like they've just had winnable matches for these Major 2 qualifiers. And going through it, I remember now. So it started with them playing Florida, and I know I picked Gorillas over Florida, but Florida took that one 3-2. The Gorillas did win both hard points in that series. Again, going back to what we talked about with Florida, though, Florida takes the searches. And then the Gorillas had the upset over the Thieves, so that was a quality win for them. And then they had this match here against Minnesota, which is another quality win in the sense that Minnesota was just coming off their victory over FaZe, and we don't really know. At least in my eyes now, I'm just super confused about Minnesota and where to put them because, you know, beating FaZe, losing the Gorillas, it's kind of like coin toss at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So winnable matches for the Gorillas so far for this iteration of the team. This week, though,
Not winnable. Well,
they
winnable,
play
but
FaZe.
hard.
They play FaZe in Toronto, so this
Yeah.
will be the real test, I think, for what the Gorillas are capable of. We did see. I don't remember the exact result, but I know LAG Academy played FaZe at Major 1 in group play, and it went map 5. So I don't remember if LAG Academy won both hardpoints in that series or not, but obviously that was 3/4 of this current LAG roster. So that could be a good match, and it's the revenge match for RCDs going up against the team that dropped them too, so storyline there. But yeah, I just think this was a good win for the Gorillas over a Minnesota team coming off a good win itself. Don't really know what to think of Minnesota as a result of their results this past week. We'll have to see what they're able to do the following week. But I'm looking forward to seeing what what LAG is able to do with 2 tough matchups on paper this weekend.
In that LAG Academy FaZe game match, it was so FaZe lost both hard points, but won the control, and then obviously won both searches, winning 3-2. I mean, that would seem to indicate that we might be in for a really good series this week as well.
Well, let me see for a second here. They might be undefeated in hardpoint with this current because let's see, they beat Florida and they went 2-0 in hardpoint. Or they lost to Florida but went 2-0 in hardpoint. Sorry. They beat the Thieves 3-1, went 2-0 in hardpoint, and
Yep,
they beat
undefeated.
Minnesota, went 2-0. So they're 6-0 in hardpoint with this current roster.
Yeah, an 0-3 in control, coincidentally. So yeah, I mean it's really
Small
good.
sample size, but
Yeah, really small sample size, and all of it is online at the moment. But from what we can tell, they are very good in hardpoint. That being said, we don't really know how well each of those 3 teams that they beat, what to make of them at the moment, because Florida is, you know, obviously in disarray. They've already made a roster change now. LAT have been just up and down, mostly down. And then Minnesota, like you just said, you don't know what to make of them at the moment because they just beat FaZe and then they lose to LAG, which could just say a lot about LAG. We might find out, but at the moment, my thinking is that Minnesota is still learning how to play together or something along those lines that they will grow into it because I just kind of believe in that roster more so than this LAG team at the moment. But we'll see. I've been wrong many, 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 many times before. It could be another case. And then if it is the case, I will be breaking out my LAG merch to wear on stream at some point. But yeah, so LAG beat Minnesota. And then in the final match of the qualifiers of this week of qualifiers, at least, Atlanta FaZe beat the New York Subliners in a really good match, went to game 5. Atlanta comes out with the victory. Any thoughts on this after seeing the day before Atlanta get swept by Minnesota?
Yeah, I mean, this was a really big win for Atlanta, just in the sense of taking down the reigning champ. Obviously, then I'm pretty sure New York was the team. Yeah, New York eliminated Atlanta at the major because they faced off in the losers final, so New York beat them to get to the grand finals. Um, but it was just a super long series. Like it was happening during the Cowboys game, so I was watching on and off. But there's just a lot of delays. There was no broadcast or no commentary because of the snowstorm in Columbus, so it was just gameplay. Then the map 5 had like 3 delays just in map 5 itself. It went like 3-2, then massive pause, then it went like 4-3, massive pause, and then they finished it again. So really weird series. I'm pretty sure I saw like multiple players in the series just talking about how it was a draining one that took forever. So that could have an impact on the actual result. But outside of the 6-5 final map, New York does win both hard points, including a 100-point club on Hydro hard point in game 4, which is something I want to talk about real quick. I just
Yeah.
side note, I didn't. I felt like there were spawn changes that were mentioned by a lot of the CDL teams heading into the first week of the qualifiers, and I don't think I would have to go through those results again. I'm pretty confident though that we didn't see Zarqua Hydroelectric played at all in the first week, and we saw it played multiple times in this second week of qualifiers. So maybe it's at the point now where teams are kind of figuring out the spawns a little bit. Maybe they're just experimenting with their map pool for the online qualifiers. Don't really know, but that is something I personally have been keeping my eye on just because I feel like we didn't see it all first week, like I said, and now we're seeing it a little bit more. Um, so unclear who picked it in this scenario, but that was a pretty convincing 100-point club by New York. But New York wins both hard points in this. Atlanta goes the Neslo route with the 2-3-5. But they win the searches 6-4, 6-5. So it was a hard-fought series filled with technical issues and delays and whatnot. But in the end, Atlanta is able to get a big win against the reigning major champs.
Yeah, and so I'm looking at the stats from stage 2 or whatever, major 2 qualifiers. FaZe 1-3 in hardpoint, 3-1 in search, and 2-1 in control. So I'm not sure if that's going to be indicative of what happens in the major, because who knows how that'll translate. But even if you look at the stats from Major 1, Atlanta, they were 5-6 in hardpoint in Major 1, but 7-1 in search, and then they were 500 in control. So it kind of tracks right now how they're doing, and that's kind of how they did in the first major, which will be interesting because, I mean, to go 500 in respawns in general will make it a little bit difficult, but I mean they have a really good search team that what you could tell just from like the roster that this should be a really good search team. They're pretty much all made up of search and destroy kids. Like Simp and Selim and Abizi are like, they're ridiculous. And then Slasher, I mean, I remember him from like Black Ops 2 and Ghost, that he was a really good like online player as well. So it's be interesting to see these two teams match up again. I really want to, because I just think like it might go in phases direction, and I would just like to see it without all of the pauses and the kind of like stop and start kind of stuff. So yeah, that does it for the recap. but or the the recapping of our matches. The pick'em right now, you are 22-22 because you went 6-4 on the week. I am not 500. I am 20-24 on the season, 4-6 this week. So there's some ground to be made up. And let's get into our predictions. Going into this final week of Major 2 qualifiers. So it'll start on Friday, January 27th. Florida versus London. Florida, obviously, first match with Dave Patty back in the lineup, his season debut for the Mutineers. London kind of trying to capitalize on their their first win of the qualifiers against Vegas. Who do you got between the Mutineers and the Royal Ravens?
I wish I didn't have to pick either team, to be honest.
They
but
both lose.
I think London is going to take it, but I can't get off the not picking London train, so I'm going to go with Florida.
I'm going to go with London because I need to probably pick a little different than you, and I'm also scared that I'm going to pick against London and they're going to win again. And we're also just canceling out the jinx, so we'll see how it goes. Vegas versus New York. Vegas, bad week last week, and the Subliners obviously didn't finish particularly well, but they had a very hard-fought game to finish out the week. I'm going to go with the Subliners. I'm assuming the same for you.
Yep.
Atlanta versus LAG in the final match of Friday. I got to go with FaZe. I'm not too high on LAG, and even if I was, it's FaZe, so I try not to pick against them if I can help it.
Yep, I'm going FaZe here, but just a reminder what we talked about like 10 minutes ago. We saw a close matchup with the LAG Academy, 3/4 of the current LAG squad, and I'm pretty sure this is the first time Arcides is going up against his former teammate, so wouldn't be surprised if LAG pulls off the upset here, but I'm going to go with Atlanta.
Saturday, January 28th, LAG versus Toronto. I'm going to go with Toronto, but I mean, you're kind of talking me into the Gorillas hype train right now, so I'm a little scared.
I mean, and this is another one, right? Like on paper, you expect Toronto to take this one, but the way LAG's been playing recently, and especially, Toronto's coming off that series where they lost 2 hard points to OpTic after OpTic lost 2 hard points to Seattle. LAG's looking strong with his current roster and hard point. Who knows what happens? I still got to go with Toronto, though.
Yeah, it's definitely a week for LAG that will show what kind of team they are, at least going into the major. If they go 2-0, people are going to be like, holy crap, this team is like a contender to win, which would be very ironic considering they won Major 2 last year, despite not being favored very highly.
They would be 4-1 in the Major 2 qualifiers if they somehow go 2-0 this week, so they would have to be like a top 3 seed.
Yeah, it'd be ridiculous. Another team that has a chance at being a contender going into Major 2, OpTic. They play against the Vegas Legion. This should be on paper, this should be a pretty one-sided affair considering how bad Vegas has played in everything but search, and then OpTic has been playing well in search with this new roster. You would think that OpTic matches up very well with this team, and I'm going to go with OpTic. I'm assuming the same for you.
Yep.
Florida versus Boston. Again, Florida, they play on Friday in their first match with Dave Patty, but I mean, I think I just got to go with Boston on this one.
I am too. Just
It's a Big Wake revenge game.
That's what I was going to say. I believe this is Big Wake's first match against his former franchise of 2 years. Is it more than? No, because he was on MW 2019. Yeah, so 2+ years. Yeah.
So yeah, big match for Big Wake, which is they should make a graphic of that for the CDL. And the final match of Saturday, Seattle versus New York. I have to go with the Subliners, but this is probably one of the more interesting ones because I want to see what Seattle looks like going into this major. Because if they get swept or a pretty one-sided 3-1, I'd be pretty concerned going into Major 2 for them.
Yep, I got to go in New York too, and this is a good match because we saw Seattle beat New York at the major in the winners bracket. Then New York gets revenge in the grand finals. So. Unless they played in the first set of online qualifiers, which I don't think they would if they're playing them now. This is, the rubber game for them early in the season. So we'll see how it goes, but I got to go to New York.
Final three matches of the weekend on Sunday, January 29th. Minnesota versus Seattle. We just talked about Seattle, obviously. Oh, this one's difficult. This one
Yep.
might actually be the hardest one to pick, other than like Florida versus London.
Yep.
Um, I I've just seen more of Seattle like over the past like year, and I just know more about what they're capable of at the moment. So I'll go with the Surge, but I'm very not confident in that pick.
100%, same situation. I'm going with Seattle. You know, don't know what to expect out of Minnesota. Seattle potentially coming off a loss against New York would be 0-4 if that's the case going into their final game. They'll obviously be looking to get one on the board so they don't go 0-5. But who knows? I could see either team winning it because again, I really don't know what to think of Minnesota. I'm going to go with Seattle though.
LA Thieves versus the Boston Breach, a cross country game, which are always fun in online Call of Duty. And has it been confirmed that Kenny will be playing this week? Okay, so
Nope.
I'm gonna go with the Thieves anyway. Maybe this will be a Capsidal revenge game. Who
It could
knows?
be.
So I'm gonna go with the Thieves, but I'm very not confident in that one either.
Yeah, I got to go with Boston for the same reason you're not taking them, just because we don't know the roster situation for the Thieves. Um, but highlighting the potential of a Capitol revenge game if he stays in the lineup would definitely be another interesting storyline for this final week of qualifiers.
Even if Kenny came back, I would still be not very confident in that pick because even with Kenny, they haven't looked great. And Boston, I think, is capable of being like a top 6 team as well. So they're right around the same level at this point in the season. It's going to be a weird game. And the final match is the one that I'm sure a lot of people are very interested in. Atlanta FaZe versus OpTic Texas. I don't know. Is there a nickname for this one? Because I know we have the HBR Classic that is patent pending for LAT OpTic. OpTic Envy used to be the E Classico. I don't know if there's a FaZe versus OpTic. This is just like the viewership bowl. Like this is the only match that everybody gives a damn about most of the time. A really good match, I'm assuming, especially if OpTic wins against Vegas and Atlanta wins their first match of the week against LAG. They would be one of the two of the top seeds going into the major. And this would be a really big seeding match and just a big momentum shift. If OpTic loses their final match before they go to the major, they have a lot of fans to be talking about how this player needs to be dropped, Rambo needs to be fired, blah, blah, blah. Like, I always think that there's a little more pressure on OpTic, regardless of, kind of the circumstances. But, and the viewership for this, for especially if Scump is having a watch party, it's going to be crazy for Atlanta versus OpTic. I'm going to go with FaZe. Sunday's looking to be a really good day of matches.
Yep.
I don't have a real good reason, just kind of a gut feeling because OpTic has looked pretty good, but very, very interested to see how this one plays out.
Yeah, it should be a good match, especially based on OpTic's performance with this new lineup in just 1 week. Now they're going to have another week of practice under their belt on top of their 2-0 performance last week, so should be a good one. But I'm going to go with FaZe as well.
And that about does it. Anything you want to talk about before we get out of here? I know we covered the watch party a little bit with Scump. That was kind of like the biggest thing from the weekend other than the matches. Anything you got?
Yeah. You just scroll up a little bit, you can pull up the Major 2 standings for the qualifier. We
Yeah,
can
put it
just
on
run
screen.
through that real quick. Yeah.
Yep, 1 second. So, so OpTic at the moment at the top of the standings, which is kind of crazy considering how much stuff has been going around for OpTic so far. This is not cropped correctly at the moment, but 1 minute. Jesus.
I'll just run through it real quick, and
All right.
as it pulls up, viewers who are watching the video can see. So for the Major 2 qualifiers, strictly speaking, not the CDL overall, OpTic is in first place right now with 30 points. They're technically tied with Toronto, but OpTic is 3-0. Toronto is 3-1. Toronto has that head-to-head loss with OpTic too, so even if they were to both end at 4-1, OpTic would have the advantage there if it was just a two-way tiebreaker. So Toronto's in second, 30 points, 3-1. We have 5 teams with 20 points. Four of those teams, starting with Boston, New York, LAG, and FaZe, are 2-1. The Rocker are 2-2. So Rocker has the worst record of those 5 teams. That puts them in 7th place heading into this final week of qualifiers. And then we have 4 teams at 10 points, which means they have 1 win. Florida and Vegas are 1-2, so they still have 2 matches to go, whereas the Thieves and London are 1-3 with only 1 match to go, which means the best they could finish is 2-3. And rounding out the bottom of the standings with 0 points is the 0-3 Seattle, so they do have a chance to pick up 2 wins. But kind of, as we alluded to, they have some difficult matchups this week with New York and Minnesota, taking into account we don't really know what to expect from Minnesota at this point. So, if the qualifiers ended today, the 4 teams, because unlike Major 1, which was a Pro-Am style, this is going back to the format we saw for the majors last year, where it's just the 12 CDL franchises at the major. 8 teams from these qualifiers start in winners bracket. Bottom 4 automatically start the tournament in the losers bracket, which isn't an ideal scenario because that just means you lose 1 match and you're done. So if the qualifiers ended today, Vegas, Thieves, London, and Seattle would be those 4 teams starting in the losers bracket right away. But obviously, Thieves and London only have 1 match, but Vegas and Surge have 2, so they have a little bit better chance of escaping that. But even with just 1 win for Thieves and London, 2 and 3 gives you a decent chance with tiebreakers to potentially get up out of the cellar there and avoid the loser bracket. We'll just have to see what happens this weekend because this picture will probably look very different for at least, I'll say like half the teams will be in different spots most likely by the end of this following weekend.
Yeah, a lot of seeding implications heading into this weekend, and quite a lot, I'm sure, riding on the performance of these teams at the major as far as roster changes go, because we'll be about halfway through the season, or whatever, 30-40% through the season at that point. And then it gets to the time where teams feel obligated to make changes if they're not in like a real good spot. We've already seen Florida make a change. London's made a few changes. Who knows what Seattle does, considering they were offered allegedly a ton of money for Pred and declined that and said that it wasn't even close or something like that, which was a very interesting story. But yeah, a lot of roster changes could be happening in a few weeks after the major, and a lot riding on this week in particular as we get closer and closer to Major 2. But yeah, so you see the standings on the screen right now. If you're listening, you can always look at the CDL Twitter at COD League. They have I believe this is pinned, right? They have the standings for the CDL, or it's one of the most recent pictures at the time of recording. So if you want to go and look through that as well, it's also on callofdutyleague.com to look at the standings there. But yeah, that about does it for us. We will be back next week, probably doing the live show, I would imagine, on January 31st. If all things go according to plan, which means that if you're listening on like the podcasting platforms, that you'll be getting it on February 1st on Wednesday. And I believe the major start on Thursday next week, or Friday. So Thursday. So yeah, so February 2nd, I believe then, which means that we might be doing this on Monday. Depends on the scheduling and stuff. But we will be back next week. We will not dip out like we did last time and not talk to you for a month, hopefully. So that's definitely not the plan at the moment. But we'll be back next week. Make sure to like and subscribe. Follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. We live stream the podcast on Twitch, twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast. You can follow us on Twitter. He's at jbink with 2Ks. I'm at Pres Byers, and the podcast Twitter is at Ego Chall Podcast. And that about does it. Bink, take it away.
Yep, short and sweet this time. Thank you guys as always for tuning in. Should be a good weekend of matches to wrap this one up leading into the major. So hope you guys enjoyed this show and looking forward to talking to you about the upcoming 10 matches heading into the major next week. So we'll see you then. As always, remember to send the chow.